Before we get into it, we just want to note that we encourage you to ask questions as we go along. You should see an Ask the Speaker box just to the right of the window where you're seeing me right now. Feel free to pop your questions in there at any time, and we'll answer them as we go along. And you are going to be in great hands today, as I'm joined here by Todd Ablowitz, who is your presenter today. Todd is the co-founder and co-CEO of Infinicept. He has a wealth of payments knowledge and experience, and he is excited to share some of that with you today. So with that, Todd, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Well, I think we'd all agree it's better to have wealth of money than a wealth of payments knowledge, but I guess that's the best we can do. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to this. As Andrea said, I've been around for a minute, which basically means I'm old. So I'll take that age and see if some of the merchant pricing experiences I have can be helpful for you. I do encourage questions at any point. I also encourage heckling me or making fun of me in public. If you don't do that, you would actually be unusual. So let's get right into it. So we're going to talk a little bit. Some of this is probably remedial or things that you already know, but we have people with lots of different amounts of experience. So some of our other webinars, we've talked about the components of a transaction and who's involved in what, but we'll go back over that. And then we will talk a little bit about where the merchant discount rates and what merchants pay. How does that get put together? What are the components? We'll talk a little bit about basis point math. This is the word that I think differentiates payments people from all others is they start talking about things like basis points. I guess if you do mortgages, you might think about that as well. So we'll explain what that is, a little bit of quick payments math. Everyone loves math, but this is a place where it can be really helpful as you're trying to figure out what merchants are paying today, how to think about pricing them, and really across a portfolio, how to think about pricing your portfolio, how to think about managing your portfolio from a pricing perspective. And then we're going to drill down on different kinds of pricing models, interchange plus, flat rate, tiered, and then we'll go into some examples. Depending on how much time we have and how many questions we have, we'll go as deep or as shallow on that as we have time for. So let's get to it. So these are the components of or the people, companies that are involved in payments. Some of these, and I'll get into those, have lots of different names, and you'll hear a lot of terms get thrown around. The card networks, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover. For non-bank cards or for certain types of debit cards, you've got a bunch of other networks like Star and Interlink. And then, of course, there's alternative payment types, which are not in scope here. They call this the four-party system. We're talking about 5 parties in this, but this is sometimes called the four-party system. So you've got the card networks in the middle. On one side, you've got the issuing banks representing the cardholder. On the other side, you've got the acquiring banks representing the merchant. So we then get into, so the acquiring bank, one of the things that's important to know is in the US market, and this is a pretty US focused presentation. You will see differences as you go around the world, but in the US market, there must be a bank on each side of the transaction. There is always an issuing bank. Even if you're looking at a Chase card, even if you're looking at a United card, Chase Bank is still part of it. You're looking at a Square device and a Square processing system. You're going to be, yes, I will address the change necessitated by Dodd-Frank, and I think that'll be really appropriate, Kevin. It's nice to see your name up there. It'll be appropriate in a minute. I usually take the question right at the second, but I'll address that in a couple minutes if that's okay. So acquiring banks are always on the side. In the case of Square, my last recollection was that Square was sponsored by Chase. And so you've got the acquiring bank always on the one side, and then you've got always, whether it's owned by the bank or a separate entity, whether it's owned by the ultimate acquiring entity or not, there's always a payment processor. Somebody has to translate the files and the data from the transaction, send it over to the card brand and get the information back from the card brand. We'll get that in a minute. And then there is someone that takes all of those ingredients and sells them to the merchant. And traditionally, people would call that an acquirer, or there may be an ISO, an independent sales organization involved. There may be a payment facilitator involved. There's a lot of different constructs to bring it all together to the merchant, but that's sort of that entity that's on the contract with the merchant. So let's go, and again, Kevin, I will address the Durbin Amendment and which was part of Dodd-Frank. And I think it'll be appropriate when we get to the actual interchange. Look at this. So it looks like my build broke. So I don't know what to do with that. But you've got a merchant, you've got a payment facilitator, you've got a processor, and you've got the card networks. And so the consumer uses the card, makes the purchase goes to the payment facilitator or whomever is that front line. I'm going to build this again just so I can talk to it. You've got the transaction going to the payment facilitator. They're going to send that to a processor that's going to submit the transactions to the card network. The card network's going to take those transactions and they're going to send back data to the processor and money to the bank. And then the processor is going to, I'm going to build it again. The processor is going to fund the payment facilitator, who in turn is going to fund the merchant. Any questions about that? If not, we're going to get into pricing. Okay. So on a $100 transaction, we're going to break down what are the 4 components of payment processing fees. So let's assume the price that's being charged on that particular transaction is 2.9% and 30 cents. That comes to $3.20. So if you look, these are roughly the proportions that you can expect of the transaction. So $2 or so is interchange. Interchange is the money that goes ultimately from the merchant, passed through the acquirer, passed through the card network, and ultimately becomes revenue for the issuing bank. So interchange, the largest part of the money that merchants pay, ends up at the bank that issued the card. The next piece, if you look just a little to the right of that, we're going to address network fees next. It's a little bit smaller than what we assumed the processing cost would be, but the network fees are ultimately paid by the merchant, passed through the acquirer, passed through the acquirer, and ultimately are revenue for the networks. That's Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover. Those are network fees. Now, you may sometimes hear them called assessments. In the old days, those were the only network fees. But as Visa and MasterCard became public companies, they started to come up with new and different types of fees beyond the assessments. So the assessments, and we can talk a little bit about how much each of these are, but the assessments might be 13 basis points. We'll talk about what a basis point is, but 0.13%, and there might be a couple of cents in other network fees, and there might be some monthly fees per merchant. So that's interchange and network fees are often thought of as pass-through fees. And we'll talk when we go and break down a little bit more on the pricing types, that those pass-throughs are ultimately interchange and network fees. So for processing cost, the processing cost ultimately goes to the entity that sold you the payment the payment service. So in the case of, let's say, a Square, they would be ultimately collecting the processing cost, and that gets paid if they use a third-party processor. That would go to the third-party processor and the acquiring bank. In the case of an acquirer like JP Morgan, they own their processing system. They sell merchants directly. They are a bank. So it's only one entity getting the processing cost and the margin. But but in the case where you have separate parties doing the sales, doing the processing, doing the banking, those would get split up into those different people. And what's left, if you got $2 plus 35 cents of fees, so $2.35, what's left is $1.45, and the $1.45 is margin. That's the net revenue. And a lot of the companies that process payments and sell to merchants, they use that as their main metric that they pay attention to. How much net revenue do they make on the total of their merchant portfolio? And then they start to count things like expenses. Interesting fact that whomever is pricing the merchant and whomever is taking the risk on those merchants, they're the ones who can consider gross revenue before interchange and network fees as their top line, and net revenue after those as their net revenue or gross profit. Parties that are just helping sell it but don't set the price or don't take any risk, they need to take that $1.45 as their top line revenue. Kevin, I'm going to get back to your question soon here because I think it'll really be salient in a couple minutes. So let's just go back into what does all this mean. So what's a basis point? The easiest thing to think about is to go back and forth between percentages, just a flat multiplication, and a basis point. They're all the same thing. 0.01% is the same thing as 0.0001, and it's the same thing as 1 basis point. So on a $100 transaction, a basis point is a penny. So $100 times 0.0001 is a penny. $100 times 0.01% is a penny. Now, how do you put this into practice? A lot of times, if you've got, in the prior example, we had 2.9% plus 30 cents. How do you compare those if one pricing is just a flat percentage and another one is a percentage plus a dollar amount? Or you see how much it costs for a transaction. Or you have 2.9 and 30 cents compared to 3.5% and 10 cents. The way you do that is you can move back and forth between rate and fee based on the average ticket. So on a $100 transaction, 3.5% is $3.50. Simply 3.5% times $100 is $3.50. Okay, now let's go the other direction. So you've got a $100 transaction and it costs 30 cents. Well, what percent is that? You take the per transaction fee, 30 cents, divided by the transaction size, $100, and it comes to 0.3%. It's really easy on $100 because the basis points can go right over to cents. But on other average tickets, it can get, you have to do the math. You can't just guess it. Okay. So now we're going to go into some different types of pricing models. And this is really just ways to express the pricing to merchants. And all three of them are valid. And these aren't the only ones, but these are the ones we see out there the most. So you'll hear sometimes an interchange plus pricing. Interchange plus means whatever the interchange rate is. There's over 1,000 interchange rates. And we'll talk a little bit about how interchange rates get set. But there's over 1,000 of them. And interchange plus is that pass-through concept where the payment company, the embedded payments company, for example, would price the merchant and just say, okay, whatever interchange is, you pay. Whatever network fees are, you pay. And we're just going to add something to it. So every transaction could have a different price. And it just depends on how interchange comes through. And maybe I'll take a minute now and explain how interchange is set. Interchange is, first off, what kind of merchant. The merchant category code is in every transaction. So the merchant type is known. Schools have different interchange opportunities than hotels, which are different than retailers, which are different from government and other verticals. So the first thing is the merchant type. The second thing is how was it processed? So was it card present? Was it card not present? Was it tapped? Was it dipped? Was it keyed in? All of those have their own implications on what the interchange cost is. And then the third component is how was the data sent across? Like you could send the same card not present transaction, but not include a 6-digit order number, and you're not going to get as good of an interchange rate. Or if you do a business card and you send a business card across, you're not going to get as good of an interchange rate if you send a business card without tax information. The last thing is, what type of card is it? And this is where we're going to address the Durbin Amendment. So the types of cards will determine how much you pay. A debit card is going to be a different price than a credit card, which is going to be just a basic credit card. It will be different from a rewards card, which will be different from a high spending card. And one of the reasons the card brands have done that and done more and more of that is they're competing with each other for banks to use their card. So Visa wants to have a really souped up, expensive signature card to show banks that their high value customers can make them a lot of money in interchange. And in return, the banks give really big rewards for those really high earning cards. And there's a whole bunch of rules that go into it. So you pay way more for a fancy card than you do for a basic card. And it's just like the fact that Amex typically is a little more expensive than Visa and MasterCard. So how does that get into debit cards? Well, debit cards have 2 separate rate schedules. The reason that they have 2 separate rate schedules is in 2011, if I have my dates right, and this is Kevin's question about Dodd-Frank, at the very late stages of the banking regulation called Dodd-Frank, one of the senators, Dick Durbin, introduced an amendment at the very last second that had to be voted on. And he got a majority of senators to vote for the Durbin Amendment. And it basically says, and I'm not a lawyer, so legal details aside, the Durbin Amendment basically set pricing or required the Federal Reserve to set pricing on debit cards. And this pricing was required to be set at the cost of processing and issuing those debit cards. But in part of the markup, when the bill was going back and forth, some of the opposition convinced the majority to limit that rule to banks at $10 billion in assets and above. So big banks have regulated debit rates, and smaller banks are not regulated. When the Federal Reserve came out, they took a couple years to create the models that told them what the cost of debit cards was. And they basically settled on 22 cents a transaction and 5/100ths of a percent or 5 basis points. So all debit cards, regardless of how they're processed, if they're issued by a big bank, they're all 22 basis points and 22 cents and 5 basis points. There's a small exception to that. Some banks have not initiated some fraud things and they get just a little less, 21 cents and 5 basis points. This caused a huge uproar among small ticket merchants. So after this came out, McDonald's had just started taking cards, and think about 22 cents on a $5 transaction is way more expensive than 22 cents on a $100 transaction. And that goes into that basis point math. So you've got thousands of interchange rates based on the things I described. Kevin, let me know if you wanted to drill down on anything with Durbin. So the interchange rates are going to be different on an interchange plus pricing model. Flat rate, you'll see it's one price across all the different transactions, and then tiered. This is an example of a 3-tiered. This graph is a 3-tiered. The red transaction or the red bars are the components of it that are costs that are passed through, and the pink are margin. And then I'm going to go. I already went pretty deep on Interchange Plus, but we'll talk about pros and cons, and then I'll address your follow-up question. So the positives of Interchange Plus, it's super transparent. Every transaction is reported out at the real costs. One thing as a side note, there are bad actors out there that claim that they're giving Interchange Plus, but actually marking it up. And that is something to absolutely watch out for. As far as I'm concerned, that's fraud. And I think the government would agree with that. But there have been some very big players that do that. And highly encourage you to pay attention and make sure that Interchange is not being marked up if you're involved in the transaction. So Interchange Plus is highly transparent. It's considered very fair. And on the other hand, it's a super complicated statement. You cannot predict how much you're going to pay. It's going to be different every month depending on your card mix, depending on details like the way cards are processed. It's difficult. Before I move on to flat pricing, Kevin is referencing the new Durbin credit card amendment. And I'm not, even though I'm on the ETA, I'm not super familiar with all of the different legislation, but I know that one of them, one of the other things that came up in debit cards is they required, the Durbin Amendment required that every card have at least 2 unaffiliated networks on the card. Typically there's one on the front like Visa or MasterCard and at least one on the back like Star, Nice, Pulse. And that was required. But there's some new requirements that are bumping around Capitol Hill about how the routing must be done, that the routing must be a choice, I believe. And there's also some talk about credit cards with some changes to the routing to have unaffiliated networks, as well as setting the prices of credit cards. If you're interested in more details on the credit card amendments, I highly recommend Electronic Transactions Association. I'm very involved, have been for 20 plus years. It's the best organization that touches payments. Everybody involved in payments should be a member of ETA, and they do the lobbying on our behalf. They do information, education. They have multiple events. So highly recommend that. And you can go deeper on things revolving around Durbin. Also, Kevin or anyone else, if you have more detailed questions or want more, I talk to the head of government relations at ETA all the time, so I can get further information about stuff if you need it. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Oh, I'm pressing on this console here. There we go. Okay. All right, so for flat rate pricing, you have the same price for every single transaction. Let's say you're paying 3.5% and 30 cents. That's what you pay for every single transaction. So that's great because it's really easy to understand. The merchant knows exactly what they're paying, and you can still not only can you predict your margins because you can guess what the mix of cards will be, and after a little bit of time, you'll pretty much know what the card mix is. And also, if you find ways to optimize your interchange, maybe by using some new technologies the card brands have, like network tokens, or by enhancing the data on business cards, you can improve your margin. You being the payments company that's setting pricing can improve your margin. The downside is that it's probably going to have to be more expensive for the merchants because you've got to make sure that you don't have transactions that you're losing money on. And the prices have to, if there's an interchange increase, you're probably going to have to raise your prices from time to time. And when you raise your prices, some merchants will go away. One note I'll say for anyone on here, I learned many years ago that with these types of pricing models, whether flat rate or tiered that we'll get to next, if you have to raise your prices because the interchange prices go up, you should build some margin, additional margin there, because whether you do that or don't do that, you will lose merchants in the same measure. So you might as well get a little bit of profitability. I'm not advocating doing anything unfair or unscrupulous. Just as costs go up, as things happen, there is an opportunity to make a little bit more money on your portfolio when those interchange increases, the bigger ones. Usually, in the old days, one interchange increase. There's always 2 a year. few times there have been interchange increases at odd times, but usually there's 2 a year, one in April and one in October. And usually one of the two has an impact on a lot of merchants. The other one probably is less significant or more about new codes or new pricing. Maybe they adjust price or even lower it on certain merchant categories or certain incentives. But usually the other one a year has a significant price increase for everyone. Okay, so for tiered pricing, this is where you might have a few tiers. You'll really commonly see on tiered pricing, you'll commonly see qualified, and that sort of means the transaction came through the best it could have. A qualified transaction would typically be card present. It would typically be a bit more basic card or a debit card. And it would typically have, sort of the enhanced data you might want to have, like it might have things that need to be in the transaction that make Visa and MasterCard able to report important things to the issuer. Business cards usually won't fall into this place. Rewards cards usually won't fall in there. Mid-qualified is where either the card type is a little more expensive or it's card not present, but it's not the most expensive. And non-qualified is where it's either a very, very expensive card type, or some data isn't passed that really should have been, or it's usually going to be a card not present environment. Not always, but usually. And so the positives of a tiered pricing is merchants can understand it. They may not easily understand why they're paying mid or non, but that's really the job of the entity selling and servicing the merchant to explain what mid-qualified means and how they interpret it, to explain how non-qualified is interpreted and what that means. There is an opportunity to enhance margin, and this is where you'll see tiered pricing get a lot of flack in the market, because what happens is unscrupulous companies will play with the tiers and enhance their margin in an egregious way. I mean, there are things that are viewed as fair and things that are not fair. If it's a business card that costs 3% to process, it's going to be a non-qualified transaction, and that is, at least in this person's view, a very fair situation where a card present swipe on a basic card would obviously be qualified. So the negatives, I started to talk about this a little bit. It's more expensive for some, maybe for many merchants, but it's easy to understand. It's not going to give you as much visibility as I talked about. And that leaves room where unscrupulous actors could play with the tiers to take advantage of merchants. But in my view, if it's done properly, it can be really nice. And I've seen, I think, some of the pricing models that I've seen out there are even more than the 3 tiers. They might be a debit price, a basic credit price, a rewards price, a business card price. You might have 6, 7, even 10 tiers that are a little more specific and explainable. And that's a great way to price too, and can be really transparent for merchants and easy to read on a statement. And this goes into the same idea as the flat, where and most of the people I think on here are learning how to set prices to merchants or wanting to know more about how these prices are set. So that's the vantage point I'm coming from. From your point of view, if interchange goes up, you are going to have to take a pricing action as these things move around. You might have to change what we call bucketing, which is what interchange level goes into what tier. You might have to change that. You might increase the amount of one or more tiers because of the changes in interchange. So this is a little bit busy, but not as busy as some of the charts coming up. If there aren't any questions yet, I'm going to go a little bit into interchange plus and flat rate and tiered, and kind of show what does it mean from an effective rate point of view. So let's start with interchange plus. The interchange rates for many of these are going to come to different costs. And we break this down on subsequent slides, and I can break that down. But you can see that for interchange plus, many of these transactions, you notice that consumer and rewards for these particular transactions happen to be the same. But Signature was more expensive by a fair amount, like 10 cents more expensive, and debit was less expensive. And because of that, if you add just this Interchange Plus, you're going to have a little bit different rate for many of these transactions. So if you look, CP stands for card present, CNP stands for card not present, and you'll see that you've got different prices for card present, card not present. But for debit, we assumed on this regulated debit, so 65% of debit cards are regulated, and you pay the same whether it's card present or card not present on regulated debit. And so for flat rate, you're going to pay the same thing for every single transaction. But in order to make it at least as profitable as other methods, it's even a little more expensive than the most expensive Interchange Plus effective rate on here. And keep in mind, I just chose these prices arbitrarily, and I made them purposely kind of high on all of them because this is what you might see advertised, or it's what the sort of the opportunity might be to charge. So for flat rate at 3.5% and 30 cents, that comes to, on a $25 average ticket, that's 4.7% or $1.17 and a half. And why would I add the third decimal point? Because you're going to have a lot of these transactions. And like my old boss, I worked at First Data early in my career, and the CEO of First Data used to have a saying, anything times a billion is a big number. So we hope we all get to billions of these transactions, and you're going to want to count those tenths of a cent. Okay, tiered pricing. If your qualified price is 2.5% and 30 cents, and your mid-qualified is 2.9% and 30 cents, and your non-qualified is 3.9% and 30 cents, you see that a basic Visa card is going to be the qualified. That's the first yellow box. The second yellow box is mid-qualified. Actually, I think this might have it as no, this is mid-qualified. And then, I don't know, I'm getting confused, but it doesn't matter. The card not present, I think most companies would probably take a basic Visa card that's card not present and put it in mid-qualified. But I think we may have messed that up here, but it doesn't really matter. The point is you're going to have an effective rate of 3.7 for some cards, effective rate of 4.1 for some cards. That's like a swiped card present. And then non-qualified for a super expensive Visa Signature card that has a very high interchange rate. Okay, let's move this forward. I lost my PowerPoint again. Okay, so let's break a couple of these down to see how we got to some of these numbers. So this one, and forgive me if this is a little bit busy, but wanted to really show you how an Interchange Plus transaction would be constructed. So the interchange rate on a Visa Rewards credit card that is swiped at a restaurant is 2.1%. So if you take the $25 times the 2.1% interchange, and then you take that same $25 times 0.14% for the assessment and 1.95 cents for the network fee, 7 cents for the processing costs, and then the margin of 75 basis points and 10 cents, you're going to get to 93.7 cents. Breaking that down a little more simply, you add all the percentages together, 2.1% plus 0.14% plus 0.75%, which is your margin, and you get 2.99% plus 18.95 cents. And that comes to 93.7 cents. And if you look, the margin on that is 75 basis points, 75 hundredths of a percent plus 10 cents. And so you're making 28 3/4 cents on that transaction. And in fact, you're making 28 3/4 cents on all the transactions, because the second one, the debit card, the cost is much lower to the merchant. The price to the merchant is much lower, 63.8 cents. You can do the same math. I won't go through it again, but you're only paying 63.8 cents plus the margin, which is 75 basis points and 10 cents. And I'm sorry, that includes the 75 basis points and 10 cents. And you end up making that same 28 3/4 cents. Let's break down a card not present for that same merchant. So let's say it's a mobile order. So now you've got the transaction fee. It's a little higher rate. On restaurants, interestingly, when we were doing this, the card present and card not present pricing are only about 10 basis points different. So that's pretty interesting. Over the years, I've usually seen interchange about 30 basis points higher for card not present versus card present. But in this particular case, looking at the interchange tables, a restaurant is going to pay about 10 basis points more for card not present than card present. So the $25 transaction times 3.09% plus the 18.95 cents, which is the sum of the interchange 10 cents, the network fees that are 1.95 cents, et cetera, and you end up with 96.2 cents. And that margin is that same flat 28.75 cents. All right, so now let's give an example of a flat rate price. So a healthcare, and we chose a different MCC, a different merchant type, because if you remember back earlier, I talked about how different merchant types are going to have different opportunities for interchange. So we looked up healthcare transactions, and if you look, their interchange is much lower than restaurants at 1.65% and 10 cents. So if you look at a flat rate for that restaurant, if they're all paying 3.5% and 30 cents, they're paying $1.17 cents. And the margin on that is going to be 53.86 cents because the total cost is 1.7125% and 11 cents. And that's going to end up being 53.86 cents. And by the way, this is a MasterCard credit card and a MasterCard debit card. And so they're going to set interchange rates a little different than Visa will do. So this MasterCard debit card, we charge the same amount, 3.5%, because this is flat pricing, 3.5% and 30 cents. So the merchant pays the same amount, but it's higher margin for the embedded payments provider. On the next page, you look at card not present. If it's a flat price and they're paying the same for card present versus card not present, you can see that the margin's less, even though the pricing is the same. And then the last example, and then I'm going to open up and see if there's any other questions. The last example, we used a landscaping business, and we used a basic Visa card, and we used tiered pricing. Well, basic consumer card that's swiped would be the qualified rate of 2.5% and 30 cents. So you take the $25 ticket. That's a pretty low ticket for landscaping, but maybe they're doing aeration. It's that time of year, at least in Colorado. So $25 transaction times 2.5% plus 30 cents for that transaction is 92 cents. And on that particular transaction, when you add up what the interchange would cost, the merchant or the provider would make about 32 cents. But on a debit card, that's also a qualified rate. The provider would make more money, 57 cents. And on a side note, we talked earlier about Durbin and the government setting the price for debit cards. The two biggest impacts from the Durbin Amendment when they did that on debit cards was, one, very large retailers made a lot of money. Two, the retailers that are much smaller did not save any money. And three, the providers in the payments ecosystem made more on debit cards than they used to. Those are just the facts of what happened after Durbin. Okay, let's go to the last example, I believe. So this same landscaper has a $25 transaction, and it's a Visa Signature Preferred credit card. The Visa Signature Preferred, I think, is the most expensive one. I think you have to spend a certain amount on it to qualify for this interchange, like $50,000 a year. And it's got really high interchange of like 2.5% and 10 cents. So on this one, this would be a non-qualified because it's such an expensive card. And so take the non-qualified price of 3.9% times 25 cents. Oh, it's also a card not present. So $25 times 3.9% add 30 cents, and it's $1.27 for that transaction. The margin on it is going to be 42 cents, 42.5 cents. Now you take a debit card, but card not present. Typically we see card not present, whether it's credit or debit, landing in a mid-qualified. And that's because the non-regulated debit cards are more expensive if they're card not present, even though the regulated debit cards are not more expensive. So take that $25 transaction, multiply it by the mid-qualified rate of 2.9%, add in 30 cents, and you get a little over $1.02. And again, those debit cards are higher margin in this scheme because the interchange is low and the price is higher. I don't expect, if you're new to merchant pricing, that every of the nuances on these slides are going to be understandable, but that's where companies like Infinicept and really other really good payment providers can help understand that and make it really accessible. I should have put a slide in this, but I didn't. I want to do one last thing before opening it up to any additional questions, and that's put a plug out there for the Embedded Payments Bill of Rights. In fact, I will put in the chat the website, Embedded Payments Bill of Rights. This is something that we started, I'd say about a year ago, last summer, so a little over a year ago, and it's 8 principles on how payments providers should treat their software company customers, and it's all about transparency, honesty, openness. Basically, the principle is if you wouldn't be proud of your mom finding out how you're pricing, then don't do it. And so we got a bunch of companies to sign up and be part of this Embedded Payments Bill of Rights. And it's something we hold ourselves to with our constituents, whether they be software companies or others. That's all I have for the prepared presentation. This is something we did for the first time. We've never done this pricing presentation before, so we'd love to get some feedback. It does look like it's a little shorter than I thought it was, but that's just fine. So are there any questions you can, I don't know, Andrea, if people can ask the questions verbally, if you can open it up that way, I'd certainly welcome that if you want, or put them in the chat. You might be on mute.
I am, thank you.
Like 2020.
So attendees should be able to see a little Ask to Speak button in the top right of their screen if you want to verbally ask a question. Otherwise, like Todd said, the chat is open.
And Kevin, I'll get your check in the mail on being a question asker. So far, I don't see any. You're absolutely welcome, Anthony. Thank you for coming on, and I hope it continues to be helpful for you. We've got much more where that came from. Well, we can leave it open for just a couple more minutes to see if anybody gets excited about a question. I look forward to meeting you in person, Anthony, the second Anthony.
I would say it's worth noting too, if you have any questions afterwards that pop up, feel free to shoot us an email and we can direct it to Todd or whoever would be the relevant person to answer that. So.
Okay, how does least cost routing achieve lower debit costs? That's a really, and you managed to go deep on these things, Kevin. These are not my biggest expertise areas, but I think I can at least say something about it. So I mentioned earlier that there are different debit networks, not just running it as a Visa or running it as a MasterCard. It's kind of like when you go to the grocery store and it says credit or debit. That's always false. And that always bugs me. And it has for like 27 years in payments. What you're actually deciding is, do I want to run this transaction as a Visa transaction or as what we used to call as online debit or PIN debit transaction? That's why you may or may not be asked to enter your PIN. Well, when you run that debit card, the Durbin Amendment sparked this concept of routing where the processors can decide if there's more than one, there's always more than one network on the back of a card. Processors can send the transaction down more than one choice of routes. And they can select the one that either A, is the lowest cost, or B, makes them the most money. Why would they do it where it would make them the most money? Well, lo and behold, several of the very large processors also own debit networks. So whether it's cheaper for the merchant or just more money for them, they can make choices there. And with merchants that have, or embedded payment providers that have, bargaining power or buying power, they can force the processor to follow the order or the logic that they want, which would be the lowest cost debit network rather than just the one that makes the processor the most money. So least cost routing kind of happens in a black box behind the scenes, and it's definitely something to pay attention to, not just what a salesman or success rep from a processor might sell, but also what is actually best for the PayFac or embedded payments provider or merchant acquirer. Did that answer your question, Kevin? Feel free to double click if you want. Okay, yay. Okay, it's 1:48 in Colorado, so I'm going to give 2 more minutes to see if anybody else thinks of a question they want to ask. I would play the Jeopardy music, but I don't have it. Sorry. Okay, 2 minutes feels like a really long time when it's dead air. So I'm going to actually go against what I said, and I'm going to give just a sec here to see if anybody has any more questions, and then we will shut this down. And I do encourage, if anybody wants to go deeper and maybe doesn't want to put their name up or ask a question verbally, set up some time. Happy to drill down on a topic. This is what we try to say at Infinicept, is we really think about trying to be knowledgeable on the payment system so that embedded payments customers of ours don't need to have a roster of payments experts. They can focus on what they're good at: go-to-market, product, building great software, embedding the payment function into that great software, serving customers with the best experience possible. And then we can be a resource for payments knowledge. And I love being on here and seeing several customers and past customers participating. Okay, final chance. Going once, going twice. Andrea, I think we can call it.
Great. Thanks, everybody.